Okay, so you guys sent us Paco Araujo's The Systems of Love.
Interesting.
And I got to say, it's really got me thinking about relationships in a whole new way.
Yeah.
Like, we're not just diving into, warm, fuzzy feelings here, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about, like, the underlying structure of love,
Yeah.
the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of how it works.
It's almost like we're going to do a blueprint reading of love.
Exactly. And how sometimes it can, maybe even fall apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what Araujo's saying is it's not some unpredictable force,
Right.
It's actually a system, a very dynamic system, and constantly adjusting based on this feedback
Right.
that it's getting.
Like a machine almost.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, so let's break this down a little bit because this book is dense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's helpful to sort of establish like the ground rules for this deep dive.
Yeah.
So the core concept that Araujo is putting forward is that love is not just butterflies and good intentions.
Right.
It's a system
Yeah.
of actions and reactions, right? It's
Yeah.
this constant flow of give and take. And the heart of this system is what he calls reinforcing and balancing loops.
Right.
So I think it's really important to understand those.
Yeah, and I think a good way to think about a reinforcing loop is it's something that amplifies itself,
Okay.
like a cycle of building trust.
Okay, so like if
You know.
let's say you share something with your partner that's really vulnerable
Right.
and they respond with empathy and understanding.
That reinforces your trust.
Yeah.
And then that makes you feel safer to share even more.
Right.
And then that deepens the intimacy and so on and so forth.
It's like a snowball effect.
Exactly. It's a positive snowball effect in this case.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's growing stronger over time.
Right. So it's like I think of it visually as this upward spiral.
Yes.
Right? The good gets better.
Yes.
You feel hurt. You share more. They listen more intently.
Mhm.
Things are good, but life is life.
Yeah. Life
Things get rocky.
Yeah.
What happens then?
Well, that's where these balancing loops come into play.
Okay.
They're the forces that try to bring things back to an equilibrium.
Okay.
So when you have disagreements or conflicts arise, and let's be honest, they always do at some point,
Always.
they introduce a kind of stress into the relationship.
Right.
And this stress might manifest as emotional distance,
Okay.
a reluctance to be as open as you were before.
Right.
And that distance then counteracts that initial reinforcing loop of trust and intimacy.
It's like the system's trying to adjust.
It is. It's trying to adjust to this new reality, this new stressor that's been introduced.
It's interesting you say that because have you ever felt like the more you try to fix something in a relationship, the worse it gets?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Yeah.
That might be a balancing loop that's become too strong.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's like pushing harder on the gas when really you should be like, easing up on the brake.
Exactly. And I think sometimes we do that in relationships, right? We think, okay, if I just do more of this,
Yeah.
if I just try harder, it'll get better.
More communication.
Yeah, more communication, more grand gestures, whatever it is. And sometimes that actually makes things worse because you're not addressing the underlying issue.
You're not addressing the balancing loops.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not that balancing loops are bad.
No, they're necessary.
They're part of the system.
Right. It's about the interplay between these two things.
Right.
You need both to adapt and grow.
Right.
But the crucial thing is balance.
Balance.
Too much of one can throw the whole thing off.
It can really destabilize the whole dynamic.
Exactly.
Okay, so to really illustrate this in a way that people can wrap their heads around, I think it's helpful to look at like a case study.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And luckily we have a really good one.
We do.
One of the most famous love stories of all time. But we're going to look at it through this new lens, through the lens of systems.
Yeah.
We're talking about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet.
Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
Classic.
Classic tragic love story.
But when you look at it through Araujo's framework, you see these loops operating with brutal efficiency.
Yes. And I think what makes Romeo and Juliet so fascinating from this perspective is that it's such an extreme example of how these external pressures and the couple's own internal reactions can really create and amplify these reinforcing loops within their love system.
Right.
And it ultimately leads to a catastrophic failure.
Right. So Araujo identifies 4 key reinforcing loops at play.
He does.
In Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
And the first one he calls the forbidden love loop.
Right.
And this one on the surface seems pretty obvious.
Yeah,
right?
it's very intuitive.
You have this intense hatred between the Montagues and the Capulets, right? This massive external wall telling them you cannot be together.
Right.
And that actually seems to fuel their passion for each other.
Exactly. And this is something that we see time and time again, right?
Yeah.
In stories and in real life, that the opposition that people face, it doesn't just fail to deter them.
It makes it stronger.
It actually intensifies the feelings it creates, that us against the world dynamic.
Right.
And it amplifies their desire and reinforces their connection.
The greater the obstacle, the more determined they become.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a psychological reason for that.
Yeah.
It's like that pressure cooker effect. The external conflict, it just turns up the internal heat.
It's that classic idea, right?
Yes.
The more someone says no, the more you want to say yes.
Exactly. And in Romeo and Juliet's case, that external pressure, it wasn't just a backdrop.
Right.
It was actively shaping and intensifying their internal world together.
Okay, so that's the first loop, forbidden love. What's the second one?
So the second reinforcing loop is what Araujo calls the escalation loop.
Oh.
And this is where things get really interesting, because the feud wasn't confined to just Romeo and Juliet.
Right. It was like a society-wide conflict.
Exactly. It was a full-blown societal conflict. And here's where it gets really interesting. The prince's attempts to quell the violence, while seemingly logical,
Right.
actually poured fuel on the fire.
Wait, so the very efforts to bring peace
Yeah.
actually made things worse?
In a way, yes. And this is where the system's thinking becomes really helpful, because...
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, think about it. The prince's increasingly severe pronouncements and punishments, intended to deter further bloodshed, they actually heightened the tension and animosity between the families.
Okay.
So it's like they were trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Yeah.
And this heightened external pressure to remain apart, it just further intensified Romeo and Juliet's bond.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle. The more the prince tried to separate them by cracking down on the families,
Right.
the more desperate and intertwined Romeo and Juliet became.
So the external pressure wasn't just this constant, it wasn't static.
Right.
It was actively escalating.
It was escalating.
And feeding back into this desperate need for each other.
Exactly. It's like the system, including the attempts to govern it, was actively working against their survival as a couple.
That's a wild thought.
It is a wild thought.
Okay, what about the third loop?
So the third one is the governance loop, and it builds directly on this idea of the prince's role.
Okay.
So Araujo argues that the prince's repeated interventions, instead of resolving the underlying conflict,
Right.
actually became another reinforcing element
Right.
that sustained the very conditions that were tearing Romeo and Juliet apart.
Okay, so instead of acting as a much-needed balancing force,
Right.
the prince's authority just became another cog in this destructive machine.
Exactly. And this is something that we see in systems all the time.
Really?
Yeah, where the intended solution becomes part of the problem.
Wow.
And in this case, the prince's authoritative actions, while they were aimed at restoring order, they didn't address the root causes of the conflict.
Right.
And so instead, they just reinforced the cycle of animosity between the Montagues and the Capulets,
Right.
and maintained this intense pressure on Romeo and Juliet's relationship.
So the system, including its governing structures,
Yes.
was locked in this destructive pattern.
Of action and reaction.
Then we have the fourth loop.
The impulsivity loop.
The impulsivity loop.
And this one feels like a direct consequence of this unbearable intensity of their forbidden love and the ever-increasing external pressures.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
As their love intensified under all of this strain, Romeo and Juliet started making these increasingly rash and impulsive decisions.
Like, what are some examples?
Well, the secret marriage, obviously.
Yeah.
Romeo's impulsive act of revenge against Tybalt.
Right.
Juliet's desperate and ultimately fatal plan with the fake death. These weren't thought-out strategies.
Right.
They were reactions to an overwhelming situation.
And it's like they were just scrambling to keep up.
Exactly. And this is where the impulsivity loop really kicks in, because each one of these decisions, it further destabilized an already volatile system.
Right.
And it amplified the risks and reinforced a cycle where intense emotion led to these irreversible and ultimately tragic consequences.
So it wasn't just bad luck.
No, it was a combination of factors.
It was a system. It was a runaway train fueled by their passionate love.
Right.
Colliding head-on with this hostile environment.
Right.
And their impulsive actions kept accelerating it.
So when you look at Romeo and Juliet through this lens,
yes,
it wasn't just star-crossed lovers. It was a love system.
Exactly.
That was fundamentally out of whack.
It was out of balance.
These reinforcing loops, the forbidden nature of their love, the escalating feud, the ineffective governance, their own growing impulsivity became overwhelmingly powerful.
Yes, they completely overwhelmed any potential balancing mechanisms that might have introduced some stability into the situation.
Right, like what could have helped?
Well, think about the delayed communication regarding Juliet's fake death.
Oh, yeah.
That was a crucial balancing element that failed spectacularly.
Right.
If Romeo had just gotten the message in time, things might have turned out very differently.
Right.
The prince's mismanaged attempts at governance certainly didn't help to dampen the conflict, and their own unchecked impulsivity, it prevented them from seeking or finding more sustainable solutions.
That's so interesting because it makes you think, what if they had managed to introduce some alternative balancing loops?
Right, and Araujo talks about this in the book.
It does.
He does. He talks about the possibility of a successful mediation between the families.
Right.
More open and timely communication between Romeo and Juliet.
Which is so important in any relationship.
So important.
Yeah.
Even a less risky plan for their escape.
Right.
These could have introduced elements that might have counteracted those powerful reinforcing loops.
That were pushing them toward tragedy.
Exactly. But instead, the system spiraled tragically out of control.
Wow. So what does all this mean for the listener, sitting at home listening to this right now?
Right. This isn't just about analyzing a centuries-old play.
Exactly.
There are some profound insights here about how we can understand the dynamics in our own relationships.
Right. Because hopefully you're not navigating a bloody family feud.
Hopefully not.
But the underlying principles
Are the same.
are the same.
The reinforcing and balancing loops are at play in all human connections.
Right.
So a healthy love system, it thrives on reinforcing loops that build trust and intimacy and shared positive experiences.
Right.
But it also absolutely needs those balancing loops, the ability to navigate disagreements constructively, to address tensions before they explode, to find ways to create security and stability when life throws curveballs.
Because without those counterbalances, even the most intense initial feelings can be eroded by persistent conflict, ineffective communication, or an inability to adapt to these inevitable challenges.
Exactly, and that's what Romeo and Juliet really highlights, is that love isn't solely about the intensity of emotion, it's fundamentally about the structures, the repeated patterns of interaction that either support or undermine its resilience.
And a relationship dominated by just those intense reinforcing loops without those healthy balancing mechanisms can become incredibly volatile.
Yes, very much like Romeo and Juliet's. And conversely, a relationship with overly dominant balancing loops and insufficient positive reinforcement might achieve a certain stability, but lack the vibrancy and the growth that sustains a deeper connection.
So it's all about finding that right balance.
Exactly.
Okay, so the crucial takeaway is to really think about the dynamics at play in your own relationships.
Yeah.
Can you identify the positive cycles of trust and intimacy that are being reinforced? And are there effective mechanisms in place for navigating conflict and maintaining balance?
Because without that equilibrium, even the most promising connections can become too fragile to last.
And that's really what Araujo is trying to get us to see.
Exactly. Understanding love as a system of these interacting forces provides this really valuable framework for recognizing patterns in your relationships. And understanding why some flourish while others falter.
So we're not just analyzing feelings in isolation. We're looking at the bigger picture.
We're looking at the bigger picture. We're looking at the system.
So to bring this deep dive into Paco Araujo's The Systems of Love and the profoundly cautionary tale of Romeo and Juliet to a close, the core insight here is that love isn't just an emotion. It's an intricate system. Of reinforcing loops that build connection. And balancing loops that manage the inevitable conflicts.
Exactly.
Understanding these dynamics, these hidden architectures of our relationships is absolutely crucial for building connections that can not only ignite with passion, but also endure the inevitable storms of life.
And I think that brings up a really important question for the listener to consider.
What's that?
Think about a significant relationship in your own life, past or present, or even one you've observed closely. What seem to be the most dominant reinforcing loops at play? What kinds of balancing loops are evident? And what might happen if those loops were somehow altered, strengthened in one area perhaps, or weakened in another? It's a fascinating and potentially very illuminating way to analyze this complex dance of human connection.
Yeah, it's really about understanding those dynamics.
It is.
So thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Until our next exploration.
Yeah, man.